Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I would like to welcome everybody to this 14th webinar on CPT, organized by Eijkelkamp North America. And we'll be talking this time about CPT reporting. And the reason that I now show you this slide on webinar 12 is not that we're suddenly going to repeat webinar 12 or that I no longer understand that this is webinar 14. But what happened in a couple months ago, I talked about performing CPT in accordance with the standards. And the follow-up of that webinar was that, hey, that's all good. Let us know some more about these standards. And basically what we did in that webinar was talk about the two major standards, the ASTM standard D5778 and the ISO standard 22476-1. But the important thing is that whatever standard you use, whether it's the ASTM standard or the ISO standard, it's basically the same procedure, the same equipment. There are two different standards, but they define the equipment and the procedure exactly the same. So we went over that procedure at length, and then after that webinar, I got a request saying, well, that's fine, but talk a little bit more about the precautions when you perform CPT. Now, what precautions do you have to take? What can go wrong? And that's what we did last month. And you see two pictures on the left that I used in that webinar. If you don't have your pusher set up vertically, then you will not push the cone into the ground vertically, and you're going to have a problem. And obviously, if you go to a job site and the road is not sturdy enough, you might see something happen that you see in the picture there, that you end up with a CPT truck in the ditch. So we talked about those precautions, and I gave some examples. And like I said, those webinars, both 12 and 13, are available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again or want to watch it because you were not available to be there, find it over there. But then after 13, the question came, yeah, that's great. Now we have performed the CPT. What's next? And what's next, of course, is reporting. And that's what we're going to talk about today in this webinar number 14. The way I want to illustrate that is from a slightly different angle. Assume that you are sitting around the project table and you have another project in the area where you've done CPT some time ago, a couple of years ago. And the question is, well, can we find that report and see what we can learn from that report? And you see that one says, yeah, I'm sure we'll have the report and I'll find it. But then also the comment was made, well, I think I was involved in that sounding, in that CPT, but there were some issues. I don't remember exactly what all the issues were, but there were some issues that came up. Oh, I apologize. Something went wrong here. There were some issues during that sounding. So the next thing then is that you go into the archives, and obviously this is not necessarily how we have archives these days anymore, but you get the picture. Trying to find a report among lots of data, whether it's electronic or still in paper form, it takes some time, it takes some effort. If you don't have a good archiving system, but in the end, you'll find it, and that's what the person reports back and said, I told you I would find it. So they're going to have a look at this CPT report that's now on the table. And then quite often what we get is something like this. Single plot of some results of a sounding that was done at some point, in this case by the CPT company that's called in the middle of nowhere. And they did a CPT. You can see in the top right-hand corner that they did that thing sometime in 2000, so about 20 years ago or so. But you also see that there's no indication of the surface elevation or the coordinates where the sounding was done, no indication of the cone type, no information about who the operator was, although in this case, it seems that we know who the operator was because he remembered what was going on. And we also see that supposedly, if you go to the pore water pressure chart in the middle, you see that supposedly the water table was right at the surface. And when I see something like this, I get the feeling that, hey guys, this report is really not complete, and it's really not the type of report that we need to get. So the question then is this all that we have? And like I said, most often that is what is still there. Not the full report, not the notes that were collected on site. They just have a single sheet with some curves on there, some squiggly lines, as I've called them in the past, and that is what you have to work with. Well, obviously, you get the feeling that I don't think that it is appropriate. So then the logical question is, what should be in a CPT report? Well, let's make it very clear. As you see here on the screen, in the top or the bottom right-hand corner, I will follow the ASTM standard, but the ISO standard is telling you exactly the same thing. Obviously, we need the squiggly lines. Now, the tip resistance, the sleeve friction, and the pore pressure. And in this case, what was done in this particular report, they also gave the friction ratio, which is nothing more or less than the sleeve friction divided by the tip resistance. That is the bare minimum. My personal recommendation is, though, that you go one step further. And in that regard, what we saw a few seconds ago in this chart gives a little bit better indication. What you see now is the cone resistance, the friction ratio, and the pore pressure. The same type of squiggly lines that we saw before. But then you see on the right-hand side of the graph, two additional charts. And that gives you the soil behavior type. Two different ways that it is displayed. The first one, the fourth column here, you see that it's basically just shown a line of what the value is, the IC value, and then you have to kind of derive what the soil is. The one that I like most is this one here, where you basically show what kind of, you show the colors that are available in a certain depth. And that gives the operator, but also the designer, very quickly an idea what's going on. That's when you go from the darker colors, which is the gravelly soils, to the bluish, greenish colors, which is the clays, etc. You get a clear feel for what is going on. And now at one glance, you can basically say, well, up to, say, 40 feet, I basically have a clay or a silty clay with a couple of sand layers in between. Gives you a very clear overview, and it gives you a first impression of what's going on. So that's the first thing that needs to be there, but that's not all. Both the ISO standard and the ASTM standard gives you then some more information. And the first part is some general information about the sounding. We want to know who was the person who did it, either name or initials. We want to know for which project it was done. And then when you go back to what I showed you earlier, to say it was done for a bridge project in the middle of nowhere, saying that the middle of nowhere is a city name, obviously is not detailed enough. So we want a specific project designation, but even that project designation is not necessarily sufficient. We want more information, more general information than that. And the first specific information, what we want, is the ground surface elevation and the water surface elevation. And let me explain to you why that is so important. I've told you in the past that what we do with CPT is we don't measure the hydrostatic pore water pressure or the equilibrium pore water pressure, which is basically the pore water pressure when the groundwater is at rest. We measure the dynamic pore water pressure. As we push the cone into the ground, we create dynamic effects that affect the pore water pressure. And what you see, what you measure, is really the black line on this chart. The blue line is the hydrostatic pressure. If we assume that the water table is here at 7 meters, then you can just very easily calculate what the hydrostatic pressure is. And you need both. Why do you need both? Well, what we're really interested in is the excess pore water pressure, the difference between the dynamic pore water pressure and the equilibrium pore water pressure. And why are we interested in that? Well, one of the ways that we can calculate or determine what kind of soil behavior type you have is this chart that you've seen now probably many times if you've attended these webinars in the past, where on the vertical axis we put a tip resistance, and on the horizontal axis this pore water parameter, pore pressure parameter. But what you see in the chart is that this pore pressure parameter is a function of the difference between the dynamic pore water pressure and the hydrostatic pore water pressure. In other words, the excess pore water pressure. So if you want to characterize your soil based on the pore water pressure, you need to know your equilibrium pore water pressure. And you get that either by making sure that you identify in the report clearly where the water table was, or by putting some dissipation test results in there so that you can derive where the water table is. That's why it's important we have this water table. Then, as I told you before, just getting the project designation and the city where it's happening is not enough. We need to have more specific information on the location, ideally speaking, the coordinates. I don't care which coordinates. Certain countries in the United States, we mainly use the GPS coordinates. Other countries, we have other coordinates. Doesn't make any difference as long as you indicate what your reference is. Then at least we know where the sounding was done. And then you can go back later on to figure out where exactly that sounding was done. And then you see a couple more informations, the sounding number, the date, the plot that we already talked about, and then also the calibration readings. That's the general information. And coming back to that location, yeah, I put on that kind of in jest on the chart that was in the middle of nowhere. This actually, I was surprised when I Googled it. There's apparently on the border between Colorado and Nebraska a restaurant that's called Middle of Nowhere. But obviously that is not sufficient information to just say that this is where my sounding was done. We need to have the actual coordinates. But there is more. Still in the same ACM standard, you see now a separate subparagraph that deals with the equipment that was used. The cone manufacturer, the cone type, cone details, cone serial number. All that information is readily available from the cone manufacturer. When you get a Eijkelkamp Geopoint Soil Solutions cone, we will provide you all that information. The type of thrust machine. What kind of pusher are you using to put the cone into the ground? And also, is that machine heavy enough that it provides adequate reaction force, or do you need to use ground anchors? Give some more information about that. And then you see some other parts in it. We need to know where the friction reducer was, if you used one, if you use any modules behind it, if you use that. And then finally, any observations concerning the recorded data. And that is very, very important, because when you're performing a CPT, as an operator, you hear things, you see things, and it's important that those things get documented. I'll come to that in a second. I'll return to that in a second to show you a couple of ways of doing that. And of course, the famous statement, wait, there's more. What you see here, just the base things that you have in the standard. And we already talked, of course, about the squiggly lines, but there is more. There are more things that you need to think about. First of all, let's talk about, again, a little bit about the cone conditioning. In the standard, because you see again at the bottom, I told you that this came out of the ACM standard. We say that piezo cones are used to measure the pore water pressure readings, and that we say that the filter elements should be replaced after every sounding, and that the port should be flushed. In other words, the cone should be fully saturated with liquid. But it says should, because some people say, well, my pore water pressures, they're not that important for this project. But that is why I went back in the beginning to a project saying, let's assume that it happened some time ago. Maybe for the project that you do right now, what you have in mind right now, pore water pressure is not that important. But you never know what happens in the future. It may be that in the future, the pore water pressure readings, for instance, to determine the soil behavior type, becomes important. And that's why, personally, I think that you should use or should replace the filter elements after every sounding. Just assume that the pore water pressure readings are essential. If not for now, then maybe for later. So just assume that they're essential and replace those pore water filter elements. The other thing that is important has to do with the penetration speed. You've heard me probably say, if not 14 times, probably even more than that, that when we do CPT, we push the cone into the ground at a speed of 2 centimeters per second, or 0.8 inches per second, and the code gives you an allowance plus or minus 5 millimeters, so that you are somewhere between 15 and 25 millimeters per second, or 0.6 and 1 inch per second. But then there's a note, and that note 8 says that if there's a precarious situation, a sudden increase in the tip resistance, or a sudden increase in your bending or the overall inclination, then as an operator, you're allowed to go at a reduced speed. We do that because we want to make sure that the operator has the flexibility to avoid damage to the cone. You don't want a broken cone. So we give an indication that that speed is, or an allowance that the speed is reduced. But all the correlations that we have derived with CPT are based on this speed of 20 millimeters per second. So if you now have a slower speed, those correlations may not be completely valid anymore. And if you don't record it, if you don't make clear that you have a lower speed, nobody is going to know. And therefore, nobody is going to adjust the data as it is finally being reviewed. So don't speed. Yes, obviously, you need to stay in line with the specifications. Don't go too fast, but also clearly indicate deviations in the report. And that brings me then to, how do you indicate it in the report? Quite often, a report includes this chart, and then you get after that a whole bunch of notes. My recommendation is to put as much information in the chart as possible. Even if you handwrite it on there, or later on electronically put a note on there on the front page, that you can clearly see what's happening. In this case, you see at the very top a couple black boxes. There was some pre-drilling done, as we saw earlier. And if there's pre-drilling done, say that you put a casing in there and you filled it with sand so that you have sufficient support over those first 6 feet or something like that, you will still get the CPT reading. But the CPT reading has nothing to do with the original soil. So therefore, also block out the soil behavior type for that same area, because it's really not relevant. What you're measuring there is the sand in the casing. It's not the original soil. So therefore, don't show that information that then may get interpreted incorrectly. But also, say that between 31 and then 35 feet with a low speed, it may be somewhere still in the follow-up pages, but those follow-up pages will get lost. And that's why I think it's very important that you make some notes there, or put an asterisk in there, or put a different color in there. There are plenty of ways of doing that, but at least indicate that there was something happening there that you want to record for the future, so that you don't, that information doesn't get lost. Now, what is the conclusion of all this stuff? When it comes to reporting, obviously you have to follow the standard. The standard tells you, as I showed you, very specific things that you have to include in the report. The second thing that I say is be honest. Not too long ago, I was reviewing a CPT report, and I was asking the person, did you follow the standard? Yes. When we then went to the original data and looked at the timestamps, it was obvious that he was going way too fast, much faster than the 25 millimeters per second. It was the last sounding. It had been a long day. He really wanted to go home, and he thought, hey, nobody's going to notice. Well, most of the time that will be indeed the case, because people may not dig into the data as deep as it sometimes happens. But in this case, there was a potential problem that we analyzed why it was, and that's why we were digging into the data. My recommendation is be honest. Put in the report the true things that have happened, but follow the standard. Also, as an operator, keep in mind to be better safe than sorry. Don't rely on your memory that you suddenly 20 years later are sitting around the table and have to think, what happened with this sounding? Because unless something very dramatic happened, you probably don't even know the details from a sounding that you did a couple of weeks ago, let alone a year or more ago. So don't rely on your memory. And that brings me to the last part. Too many notes is better than too few. If you observe something, if something went wrong, if something went different, if pre-drilling was done, make a note. Indicate it in the report so that you have a clear indication what has happened and what the engineers, when they use the data to do the design calculations based on the data, that they have to take into account because it was done somewhat differently than originally envisaged. So with that, that's what I had prepared for you today. I see two questions. Let me just go through both of them. The first one, will you display how to access the previously recorded webinars on your YouTube channel? I did not display it here. I will send you, all the attendees this time, a clear indication how to get to the webinar. I will also make sure that in the next, the announcement for the next webinar, we clearly identify where the previous webinars are found. But if you Google Eijkelkamp CPT webinars, undoubtedly Google will find them. That's how I generally find them. But you can also go to the Eijkelkamp website, eijkelkamp.com, and then just look at the videos there, and you'll find them as well. But I would just Google Eijkelkamp CPT webinars, and you'll find it. The second question that I see is, do we have the option of presenting also the push speed curve? Absolutely. You can present anything that you would possibly want to present. Most reporting software gives you tremendous flexibility to present it. You can also download the data into a spreadsheet and then make any charge that you want from that as well. Most of the time, though, that is not a curve that I would generally display, because most of the time people are staying within the speed simply because the way the setup of the equipment is. When you use Eijkelkamp CPT equipment and you push the cone down, it will automatically go the correct speed. Yes, you can go slower, but most of the time people just push the lever all the way down and they automatically go to the right speed. You also don't want to present too many charts. So what I showed you earlier, the tip resistance, the sleeve friction or the friction ratio, the pore water pressure, and then the soil behavior type, those are the main things. But if there is a problem, if there's been a problem with the speed, then you can absolutely show that curve as well. Finally, I have time for one more question. I see a question about, is the report always standard? Do you need to prepare a standard report? Yes and no. My feeling is that you are doing CPT for your clients. And I would always ask my client what they would like to see. And there are some clients that want to see it in a certain way, others want to see it in a different way. Some people like to have the paper portrait style, others want to see a landscape. Whatever they want, go that way. But once you have it for a specific client or based for your company, follow that standard, follow that same way of reporting time and time again. It becomes routine, it's much easier. And one of the beauties of CPT, as I told you many, many times by now, is that you come to the job site, you do your sounding, and in 25 minutes or so, you have a report. The beauty of most reporting softwares is that you can put all that stuff, program it in, generate the report automatically. And if you try to do it this time this way, that time that way, it's going to be confusing. You may forget certain things. So I would definitely recommend a standard report, but standardized for particular clients if they want to go a certain route. And with that, I've unfortunately come to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much, and you have a nice day.